By the mid-16th century, the early modern witch trials were reaching their greatest ferocity. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of women a day were being accused, tortured, and executed by hanging and burning. The most horrifying excesses of the trials were located in what is now Germany, where a thin judicial system, especially powerful parochial local tribunals, and a general lack of appellate courts in capital cases meant that accusations came to virtually imply confession through torture, swiftly followed by execution, sometimes that very day. And it would be into the crucible of this nightmare that a Dutch physician would profoundly challenge the reality of witchcraft, and thus the foundations of the trials raging around him. Johann Weyer, once a student of the author of the 3 books of occult philosophy, Cornelius Agrippa, would publish his attack on the trials themselves in his 1563 De Praestigiis Daemonum, on the trickery of the demons, a work that was greatly edited and expanded over the course of his lifetime. In this text, he would argue that the women being prosecuted were hapless victims of demonic possession, or more often, they suffered from what we call melancholia, a precursor to the modern conception of mental illness. However, Weyer's book would go on to a rather ironic fate in the end. It would stoke the fires of the religious tensions that were actually exacerbating the very trials he sought to end. But an appendix to this work, the Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, meant to mock the conjuration of spirits, would go on to become the backbone of the most important volume of demonic magic in history, the Goetia in the Lesser Key of Solomon. If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my other content on topics in esotericism, including curated playlists. Also, if you want to support work like this, of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider taking a look over at my Patreon. You can support me there by looking at a one-time donation via PayPal. You can even use the Super Thanks option that you can find below the video, or pick up some cool black metal-ish merch from our merch store. But now, let's explore the very complex text, the De Praestigiis Daemonum, or On the Trickery of the Demons, and the Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, the false monarchy of the demons, the ironic foundation of contemporary demonology. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. This episode is part of a much longer, ongoing series exploring the historical concepts of witchcraft and the history of the early modern witch trials. You can check out that playlist in the link above. As you may recall from previous episodes, the trials depended on a shift in the understanding of what they called maleficium, what we now translate to English as witchcraft, from the mere sin of sorcery, to what scholars now refer to as the elaborated theory of witchcraft. This is the mature notion of witchcraft as it was developed in the minds of inquisitors and jurists and theologians and philosophers. Everyone was in on the game of developing this idea of witchcraft during the late medieval and the early modern period that held that a new woman-led heretical sorcery sect had appeared in Europe, marked by entering into a pact or covenant with the devil, of course, and thus apostasy from Christianity. This would involve sexual relations with the devil and various kinds of demons, aerial flight for the purposes of attending a sabbat, or sometimes a synagogue of Satan, because anti-Semitism, which is, of course, presided over by the devil himself, at which he initiates his followers into said pact, followed by incestuous and promiscuous sex, because they're terrified of sex, the general practice of maleficent magic, the slaughter of fetuses and babies, and various means for preventing human procreation, often by making men's penises disappear. The whole aim of all this was to undermine Christianity as part of the devil's ongoing war with God. In fact, by the mid-15th century, this whole theory took on positively apocalyptic dimensions by arguing that the new witch heresy was actually part of the final attempt on the part of the devil to forestall his impending doom by basically sending all of human beings into a downward spiral of sin and crime as a final outrage against God. In fact, it was even thought that he could delay his doom through this process. Regardless, the elaborated theory of witchcraft, while it varied from region to region or writer to writer, had more or less coalesced around 1500, and it thus set the stage for the frenzied persecutions which would follow. This resulted in what scholars now believe is about the death of 40 to 60,000 people, almost 95% women, in the period up to around 1750. From around the publication of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1486-1487 through the mid-16th century, the witch trials exploded in scope and intensity, occurring from the colonial New World to Iceland, most intensely, of course, in Central Europe, and all the way to the gates of Moscow. And it's in the fury of the Central European witch trials that we find the Dutch physician, Johann Weyer, laying out his position and attacking the very institution of these witch trials in his text De Praestigiis Daemonum, or On the Trickery of the Demons. It was first published in 1563, but he greatly expanded it and reworked it throughout the course of his lifetime. Weyer himself is a very interesting figure, not only in the history of the debate over the witch trials, but also just in the history of the occult more generally. Most famously, he spent his early teens as a student of Cornelius Agrippa. Yeah, that Cornelius Agrippa, the author of the greatest Summa of Magic ever produced, the 3 books of occult philosophy. In fact, Weyer had spent time with him as a student in 1533, the year of that very text publication. Further, Weyer rightly inherits his defensive posture vis-a-vis the witch trials from Agrippa, who, as you may know, successfully defended a woman accused of witchcraft in Metz in 1518. You go, Agrippa. We're even told that he composed a now lost anti-witch hunting tract, the Adversus Lamiarum Inquisitores, or Against the Inquisitors of the Witches. However, some recent scholarship has shown that Agrippa's position is pretty complex when it comes to witchcraft, and it's called into question if he ever wrote the Adversus, or if the Adversus ever existed in the first place, so scholarship. However, Agrippa's both positive position on the power of certain kinds of magic, along with his radical skepticism, remember, he wrote a book of radical skepticism toward the end of his life, seems to have made a really powerful impression upon the young Johann Weyer. And as the witch trials ramped up around him, recall, again, how ferocious the trials were in Germany, Weyer would employ his uniquely adept understanding of magic and demonology, his skeptical, critical thinking, along with his clinical experience. This is so important. His clinical experience as a doctor to mount an attack on the very foundations of the witch trials themselves. A position that would ultimately earn him the immediate ire of every pious witch hunter in Europe. However, as we'll see, his exact positions are pretty complex, and we shouldn't aim to paint Weyer as some kind of pre-Enlightenment man of science or anything like that. He's pretty traditional in many ways. Indeed, while his conclusions are often humanistic sounding, his underlying assumptions and the reasoning itself by which he proves them are frankly rather traditional. But to appreciate both his contributions to the history of witchcraft during the most intense periods of witch hunting, along with his rather accidental, even really ironic contribution to the development of demonology and demonological practice in the occult, and the magical invocation of the spirits of the Goetia and the lesser key of Solomon, it's actually best to let's turn to the contents of the otherwise actually untranslated, and there's no modern edition of this text, of the De Praestigiis Daemonum, or On the Trickery of the Demons. The text begins exactly where you would suspect it to, with a history of the devil, from the beginning of the devil down to the period of the Reformation where Weyer found himself. The thrust of this section, and really of the book overall, is the overwhelming prevalence of the devil, but his otherwise kind of powerlessness. After rebelling against God and seducing Eve, Satan is so successful in his evil machinations that God has to destroy the entire world through that whole flood business. Literally everyone but Noah is on Team Satan by that point. Following the flood, Satan again tempts Ham, the son of Noah, with what is the most tempting of all things: power. Magical power. The kind of power that makes human beings nearly godlike. Ham teaches this magical power to his son, Mizraim. This is literally the word for Egypt in Hebrew, Mizraim, who in turn teaches it to Hermes Trismegistus, who disseminates this magical knowledge to the entire world. So, Hermes Trismegistus cameo. It's worth pointing out that even for the Protestant Weyer, who's even somewhat of an evangelical, the primordial wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, otherwise so lauded during the Renaissance, everybody loves Hermes Trismegistus. It's now reduced to basically satanic black magic. And again, ever the Protestant, Weyer extends the power of this diabolical magic into both Islam, but also into the very heart of Catholicism, portraying so much Catholic saint veneration and ritual life as basically little else than hermetic diabolism smuggled right into the heart of centuries of Christianity. Thus, the Catholic Church becomes something of a satanic front group. Yeah, the Catholic Church becomes basically a satanic front for Weyer, with much of the inner sacramental core basically diabolically corrupted. Of course, such a satanic con job requires enormous power and wit, mostly wit on the part of the devil, and Weyer goes to pains to describe the extraordinary power of Satan, from his extreme wisdom, his ability to predict the future, but especially his and his minions' ability to create illusions. And that will be the crux of this text. Divination, mostly by just knowing a bunch of stuff, and magic performed by sorcerers and so-called witches are said to be the direct result of demonic predictive skill, but especially their ability to simply fool human beings with what is the equivalent of well-performed prestidigitation or parlor tricks, basically very well-performed sleight of hand. You could even hear the word prestidigitation in the title of the text, De Praestigiis Daemonum, on the trickery of the demons. For Weyer, the devil and his demons, and by extension sorcerers and so-called witches, can only produce well-concocted illusions. Nothing else. Or sometimes they can actually they can take credit for marvels that were caused by God, and then the devil says, I did that, but he didn't really do that. Then I can't really drive this home enough. This is the core of Weyer's argument. Sorcerers, and especially so-called witches, simply can't be performing magic or necromancy because not even Satan and his demons can do that. They can just engage in trickery. Such necromancers and witches and warlocks and such are either 1, deluded by demonic trickery, or 2, they're possessed by said demons and using such trickery upon others. Regardless, in no way are they actually performing magical marvels, and as victims of either trickery of the demons or possession, sorcerers and witches should be mostly pitied and corrected and not so much punished, and especially not tortured into false confessions and then burned alive. Weyer's against that, torturing people and burning them alive. That's all well and good, but then Weyer kind of walks his position back a bit. Through the second book, he further elaborates that there are actually 3 kinds of magic doer people, magic workers. magicians who summon demons to effect said trickery, previously noted, witches who are diabolically deluded or otherwise possessed, or poisoners. Yeah, poisoners. As you may know, the Hebrew term for condemned sorcery, kishuf, which certainly shares similar Semitic roots with other types of terms in other Semitic languages, what we might call anti-social magic. You can compare the Akkadian term kishpu, for which the maklu, anti-witchcraft ritual, was developed. If you're interested in the anti-witchcraft maklu ritual from ancient Babylon, check it out in the card above. This was eventually translated into Greek as poisoner. It's worth comparing the original Hebrew of that infamous text of Exodus 22:18, "Suffer not a witch to live," in the King James translation, "Machashefa lo techai" in the original Hebrew, with the Greek Septuagintal translation, "Pharmakus u peripois ete." The Greek actually keeps the feminine gender of the Hebrew, but changes the valence of the term machashefa, which is typically associated with antisocial magic in Greek, but it also includes an element of poisoning that's not really at all to be found in the original Hebrew sense of the term, which is just sort of antisocial magic. Thus, the Greek translation of the original Hebrew brings to the front a sense of sorcery associated with poisoning, and that's probably what Weyer has in mind here. It's also worth noting that the Latin Vulgate, it was the universally recognized translation of the medieval church and the translation of his time basically, rendered that same verse as maleficos non pateriis vivere. Note that in the Latin translation, the poisoner connotation is totally removed, as well as the gender being swapped. Maleficos is male gender now, and the term just means something like evil doer, but with a strong connotation of evil magic doer by the Middle Ages. Closer to the original Hebrew, though, again, with the male gender. Not that that stopped them from killing women en masse. All that's to say that sometimes people think that the term witch in the Bible is just a mistranslation for poisoner, but that's kind of half right, mostly wrong. Yeah. But insofar as it is a carryover from the Greek translation of the Hebrew into Latin, Bible telephone game, Weyer includes poisoners under the auspices or the umbrella of sorcerers more generally, and of course people who poison people should just be appropriately punished up to including capital punishment. You can't go around giving people poisons because that's just murdering them. So in this way, they're just really separate from sorcerers in general who consort with demons, or witches who are, again, according to Weyer, either tricked or possessed by them. Them being demons. Well, that was a fun biblical translation aside. Regardless, for Weyer, while demons can engage in basically little more than trickery, the intention of the sorcerer is still malign. They're still trying to do bad stuff. After all, they are seeking out demonic aid to perform unnatural feats in defiance of God's natural law. That's a medieval no-no. Thus, while sin is certainly being committed, a crime isn't. And that's a crucial distinction, because it means that while God, and not the papist Inquisition, as Weyer would certainly remind us, God can carry out just punishment for sins, the state certainly shouldn't intervene in this case. Religious correction is in order, not state-sanctioned judicial action. Interestingly enough, Weyer does point out a glaring hypocrisy of his era. While women were being brutalized en masse for witchcraft, hardly a ceremonial magician was harmed in the making of this witch-hunting insanity. You know, because conspiracy theories never hurt anyone. What gives? Why are the dudes not getting punished? Weyer is appalled at this double standard and points out the profusion of sorcery manuals being produced during his lifetime. For example, he points to the evil and fraudulent fourth book of occult philosophy attributed to his own teacher, Cornelius Agrippa. Though he doesn't so much dwell on that, because Agrippa did write 3 other books of occult philosophy, and those are definitely about doing magic. So Weyer kind of skates on that a little bit. He is more on Team Agrippa, who composed the Vanity of the Arts and Sciences, rather than, the occult philosophy stuff. Weyer's a physician and kind of a skeptic, as you can imagine. Further, the vigilant Weyer, and again, the hardcore vigilant Protestant Weyer, doesn't ever waste a chance in this text for arguing against how all this hermetic devilry has infected the Catholic Church, and this is from the baptism of bells to the performing of other superstitions. It's all nigh paganism for the Protestant Weyer. In the end, Weyer's theory of both the power of Satan, which is relatively meager in many ways, along with how sorcerers are said to interact with demons in the production of magical feats, again, all mere illusions. This is all really traditional stuff. In fact, it's really just stuff you can find in St. Augustine way back in the City of God. None of this is terribly new. But what's key about this is how this rather traditional understanding of the devil and sorcery is resituated in Weyer's context. If the sorcerers aren't actually causing the magical harms that they're alleged to be causing, and said were witches, but only intending to such, that demons can capitalize on their ill intent through trickery, then no crime is taking place, strictly speaking. And of course, they should be held account for their evil intentions of demonic consorting. But again, that's a religious matter, not a judicial one. Weyer takes a very similar track when it comes to his analysis of witches. If learned male sorcerers are only capable of goading demons into performing feats of trickery, then so much so less powerful are unlearned, hapless, and senile women, according to Weyer. In his discussion of witches and witchcraft, Weyer engages in a sustained attack on that most infamous of witch hunting manuals, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. On his read, the Malleus's claim rests on a fundamentally inconsistent set of claims about the relation of the witch to the devil and the powers of the witch ipso facto. In the first place, for instance, Weyer points out that what we now call the elaborated theory of witchcraft rests on the witch's pact with the devil. The whole thing works because she has a pact with the devil, and that recruits her into the heretical witch army, damns her soul, and provides her access to all those fearsome demonic powers like weather magic, which made witches so fearsome in the Middle Ages. Otherwise, largely unlearned, elderly, and marginal women would have no access to power, magical, social, religious, or otherwise. Remember, it's medieval times. But for Weyer, this pact business, it's nonsense. Satan can't grant the things that he promises. Spirits can't sign or endorse a pact. They don't have arms, so they can't sign things. There are no trustworthy witnesses to vouchsafe this agreement. There's no recourse in case of breach of contract because, he's not the father of lies or anything. And the women who enter into these contracts allegedly they don't have the wherewithal to understand the legal, spiritual, and religious implications of such a contract in the beginning. Given all this, the pact with the devil is a pact in name only and would by no means hold up as an actual contract, even in the eyes of corrupt worldly courts, much less the court of divine law. Thus, this whole business of witchcraft and pacts with the devil and the heretical witch army, for Weyer, it's simply nonsense from the very start. And further, and really the crux of Weyer's argument here, is the nature of these so-called witches. In his mind, while educated male sorcerers may have evil intentions in conjuring up spirits, uneducated women are to be at least doubly exculpated from any punishments for any alleged witchcraft. In the first case, Weyer actually argues, and he actually takes up the extreme misogyny of the Malleus Maleficarum to wield that very misogyny against the Malleus. Women are simply of such a weak constitution, morally, intellectually, and spiritually, that they are so susceptible to the demonic guiles of the devil so as to simply be incapable of resisting them. Thus, they're victims of such seductions, not the willing recruits into said heretical witch army. Did I mention that I have Heretical Witch Army merch? Because I do. I have Heretical Witch Army merch. You can check it out on the merch section of the channel. Further, and more famously, Weyer leans on his considerable clinical experience as a physician to note that many of these women, almost always, almost all of these women, suffer from a condition known at that time as melancholia. This is a precursor for what we would now call something like mental illness. Now, this is a very interesting move on Weyer's part and actually rather innovative in this way. Previous to him, melancholia was typically associated with intellectual men and the rich, beset with ennui and all of this under very satanic influences and the humors in your body. Weil shifts the sense of melancholia from just a depressive imbalance of the humors, which he does maintain the humor theory of medicine. He's not a Paracelsian. He really doesn't like Paracelsus. And he isn't very innovative on the etiology of the condition. But what he does shift is that this condition can be taken on to be occurring on these hapless, uneducated women as he has it. Further, he links melancholia, at least in these cases, with a particular psychological disposition, which can increase the likelihood of delusions, confusing dreams with reality, fits of anger, memory loss, and what we might now call false memory, and overall something like psychosis or symptoms a bit like schizoaffective disorder, such as command voices. These sections of the text are so extraordinary that Weyer has been, I think kind of rightly, hailed as the father of modern psychiatry. In fact, on these merits, Sigmund Freud, Siggy Freud, went so far as to call De Praestigiis Daemonum one of the top 10 most important books ever published, because he was on team psychology. Regardless of that, they truly are extraordinary and come to the conclusion that such women obviously need medical care, not torture and execution. He even explores the role of psychotropic unguents like those described in Della Porta's Natural Magic, which I've done an episode on, in making women believe they've taken flight to the infamous witch's Sabbath. Thus, they confess to such an event taking place. Between the drugs and the melancholia, some women did probably believe that such flight and Sabbath visits did occur. But these are false confessions, and Weyer argues they should be taken with a grain of salt. It's nonsense. They can't fly to a Sabbath. And we have pharmacological grounds that they are just tripping. Thus, on the grounds of female weakness, the nonsense of the satanic pact, and the role of melancholia and drugs, the role drugs play in all of this, there simply aren't witches as such. And thus the whole horrid business of these hunts raging around him, they're the real crime. No witches, no witchcraft, no witch hunts. Now, further chapters of the De Praestigiis do deal at length with demonic possession, which Weyer does think happens, but again, it requires treatment, like exorcism and not punishment, and various kinds of safeguards against demonic power, which mostly gives Weyer an opportunity to just throw infinite shade on Catholicism at length. Even some really cool sections, some neat sections on what's going on with werewolves. Yeah, werewolves. There's a lot about werewolves in there. From what it's worth, he thinks that werewolves are either demonically possessed people, they're people suffering from melancholia, mentally ill people, or delusional people. And occasionally he even thinks that they might be abandoned children who become animal-like due to their exposure to nature. The werewolf stuff is pretty interesting. That's going to have to get an episode. In either case, they need mercy and help and not punishment. These chapters are pretty interesting, but they're not terribly germane to our discussion of witchcraft and demonology. The final chapter, just so we kind of wrap the book up in a general way, is his advice on what should be done in terms of punishments should sorcerers be prosecuted. And it's sometimes surprisingly at odds with the previous sections, which are pretty bent on mercy. Obviously, poisoners should receive strict punishment because they're killing people. But sorcerers should face basically fines and sometimes exile, and their books should be burned. Not so much on the book burning train. People who allege to detect witches through divination, which was a job you could have back then, should face charges of slander and be punished appropriately. Because again, there aren't any witches. So any accusations of someone being a witch that's inherently slanderous. In general, Weyer comes down mostly on the side of mercy, religious education, and medical treatment, though sometimes he does get medieval and oversteps himself, noting that in egregious cases of sorcery, worldly punishments should suffice when God himself, takes a break and doesn't punish people when they should be punished. Yet in other places he even argues against the death penalty for these cases, despite the fact that Mosaic law makes it explicit they should be killed. Suffer not a witch to live. After all, he notes, there are a lot of other places in the Mosaic law that insist on capital punishment, like when your children are bad. And no one does that, so we shouldn't carry out the capital punishment just because Moses said so, because we don't always do that. So much more the case when, witchcraft isn't even possible. Shouldn't even be a crime because it's not possible. Now, I'd like to tell you that when Weyer published De Praestigiis Daemonum, people came to their senses and the mass murder stopped, or even slowed down a little. Nope. Most of the scholars at the time, they just doubled down on the reality of witchcraft and basically accused Weyer of himself being in league with the devil. And his virulent anti-Catholicism went some distance, unfortunately, in stoking the very religious tensions that were underwriting some of the ferocity of the witch trials themselves. Sadly, Weyer did more to stir the pot than he did to put a lid on it, and the nightmare of the trials they'd only mount up during his lifetime and the generation to follow. The period from 1550 to 1650 being the most vicious period of the early modern witch trials. It didn't have an effect, though it did at least inaugurate public voiced skepticism of the trials that would, in the long run, that would carry the day, though only after the execution of 40 to 60,000 people, overwhelmingly women, and all of them innocent, not to mention the innumerable other people that were accused, tortured, and had their lives ruined by being accused of witchcraft. But Weyer's book had another, rather ironic afterlife, probably even more famous in many cases. Starting in 1577, the 5th edition of De Praestigiis Daemonum, Weyer began to attach an appendix to the book that he called the False Kingdom of the Demons, or the Pseudomonarchia Daemonum. This demonological catalog details scores of beings, including demons of the direction, Paimon's in there, of course Paimon's in there, their appearances of these demons, their powers, and the feudal retinues that accompany them. 69 of these demons in total, if you're curious. So 72 are mentioned. Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Satan, who are all different in these texts, seem to have been dropped out, probably to not scandalize his readership. He didn't want to be thought to be a demonologer. In addition, Weyer provides an abbreviated ritual by which these spirits are said to be summoned. He does let the reader know that he censored it just a bit to, make sure no one tries this at home. Now, Weyer, formerly a student of Cornelius Agrippa, was one of the best positioned people at that time to have a detailed understanding of necromantic magic, but remember his position on all this? He held that necromancers' attempts to summon demons represent an evil will on their part, and while demons can be summoned, they can only really affect illusions, glamour, as the magic is called in early modern English and Dungeons and Dragons, and really trickery, thus stringing the idiot necromancer along until eventual damnation results. So why would Weyer publish such a demonic list and a ritual for summoning them? Well, to mock the whole sordid business of spirit conjuring. While Weyer does believe in demons, and he does believe in possession, and even demonic summoning, he thinks these catalogs of demons are just silly. And by showing them to the light of printing, their mysterious aura, their edge core aura, it'll just evaporate. After all, the demons of the text seem a bit like something out of a children's fairy tale, and the ritual itself is just dressed up Catholic-ish exorcism, utterly typical of the time. Thus, publishing the demonological list and the ritual is meant to function as an expose on all that super spooky necromancy of his day, revealing it to be little more than fairy tales and Catholic superstition. Well, as we'll see, someone didn't get the joke, or perhaps they played it all the better. But first, where did Weyer get this list from? The demonic catalogs date back into the history of apocalyptic Judaism, at least as far back as the Book of Enoch for that matter, though the most seminal of those demonological lists is probably the Testament of Solomon, especially in the C recension. You see, recensions matter, folks. Though some catalogs like the one printed by Weyer seem to have been current in the 13th century in Europe, a list kind of like this is mentioned by Michael Scott, not that Michael Scott, and later by Trithemius, who was Agrippa's teacher, by the way. Weyer notes that he took the text from a Liber Officiorum Spiritum su Liber Dictus Impto Salomonis, Solomon, De Principibus et Regibus Daemonum, the Book of the Offices of Spirits, or the book called Impto Salomonis, concerning the princes and kings of the demons. It is interesting that they're arranged like feudal lords because, it's medieval times. A very similar text, the Livre d'Esprit, was also in currency in 15th century France. It may have been an earlier link, an urtext in the chain to Weyer's text. Similar rituals and demonic lists also appear in a range of manuscripts, including the Munich Necromancers Manual, CLM 849, produced in the 15th century, probably in Italy and maybe in Germany, and the Florentine text, the Fasciculus Rerum Geomanticum, the grab bag of geomancy. This is a manuscript that contains a wealth of all kinds of cool necromantic magic, including the C recension of the Testament of Solomon. I've covered a lot of these texts in other episodes in my playlist on Books of Magic if you want to check that out. Though, to be honest, the exact internal relations of these demonic lists, though not random, they're not consistent either. And the history and relation of all these texts remains actually an outstanding scholarly question, and we're just now beginning to get a handle on what I have to admit, it's actually a very mysterious and very complex question. If you want to go do some work on creating a stemma of these necromantic demonological lists. So lots more adventures and necromancy to come. But the ironic outcome of all of this was that Weyer's Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, probably in a defective, scrambled manuscript copy via its English translation and republication in Reginald Scott's 1584, The Discovery of Witchcraft, it would become the foundation for the Goetia in the Lesser Key of Solomon sometime in the 16th century. Of course, the Lesser Key of Solomon generally, and the Goetia specifically, would become the go-to books of ritual demonology, especially in the world of contemporary occultism, following their publication and experimentation by folks like Mathers and Uncle Al, Aleister Crowley. They massively made these books popular. Now, this state of affairs must have Weyer face-palming and rolling in his grave at the same time. He literally published the text to reveal just how silly all this demon summoning business was, only to have that very text become the foundation for the most popular book of demonic conjuration in the contemporary occult world. More people have definitely heard of the Goetia than they've heard of the Pseudomonarchia. I can't really tell who the joke's on here, but I just love these moments when history zigs, when we expect it to zag. The cunning of history sure does have a sense of humor. Oh, first is tragedy, then is joke. Or first is demonology, then is demonology. Sadly, Weyer's De Praestigiis Daemonum doesn't have a modern critical edition, and it really doesn't have a reliable translation into English, at least not a good one. It's a substantial volume that went into several different editions that were really expanded heavily, so producing a synoptic edition would be a daunting task, but somebody out there is up to it, please do that. However, you can find a précis of the opera edition, at least in volume 2 of the Howland Materials Toward a History of Witchcraft, which is just an outstanding 3-volume text. If you're interested in witchcraft, you just need to get it. The Pseudomonarchia Daemonum does, however, have a really fun recent edition along with similar related texts translated with introductions by Paul Summers Young. I love his translation because it maintains some of the jocularity of what I think Weyer had in mind when he published the Pseudomonarchia in the first place. So check that out from Black Letter Press. Of course, this is Esoterica, so much more to come on topics in witchcraft and demonology. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.